Thank you. Yes, that's right. Far more than the labor is my point. Oh, thank you.
have a few folks strolling in that I can see out there, a couple in the parking lot. But, excuse me, but we will go ahead and get started as those folks who are entering come on in and join us. I love seeing people in the front pews, closer to the front. Those of you who are PCO members, remember what it feels like to sit this close? And maybe next week you can, sit this close as well. It's kind of nice. I want to welcome everyone to coming this afternoon at 4 o'clock for this discussion on the book, What Kind of Christianity? This is going to be an informal discussion. I have read the book as part of a book group within our Presbytery of Lake Michigan Presbytery, and there's at least one other person here today, Willie, who was doing that book study as well. And so some of the questions that I'm going to raise are things that came to me as I was reading the book. But I also want this to be a general discussion so that you do not have to have read the book. So I hope my questions will kind of prompt you to think about some issues dealing with Christianity and racism. I'm going to open us in prayer and then do a little introduction of Dr. Yu. So please join me in prayer. Loving God, God of all people, you call us to have the difficult conversations that people have had throughout history. Conversations about who is included and who is not. What it means to love our neighbor as ourself. What it means to repent. And what it means to turn our hearts to new ways of being and living and serving in the world. So we ask you today to open us up to your Spirit. May the Spirit move within our hearts to free us from those things which may interfere with us hearing your word in our lives, and free us up to be in honest and open conversation with each other about the challenges we face as a people of faith, to live in accordance with your word. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. So it is really, truly a pleasure for me to have Dr. William Yu sitting beside me. I believe it was William's first year teaching at Columbia Theological Seminary when I took his church history, and then history and polity, Presbyterian history and polity. For those of you on session, you can blame Dr. Yu for my referencing the Book of Order and in appropriate or inappropriate times. So it was really, truly a wonderful opportunity. And I'm going to brag on my husband here for a minute. Brian was doing some work that allowed some flexibility in his schedule. And Brian came to every church history class, which was team taught by Dr. Yu and two other faculty members. I waited till the very last minute to take church history because I did not want to take church history. And church history, I will say, is probably not most seminary students' favorite class. But I am really glad I waited because I was benefited by having Dr. Yu as a professor and getting an orientation into the history of not just our Reformed traditions, but pre-Reformed traditions, and our Presbyterian church history that often isn't the glamorous, wonderful parts that we share in church membership classes, for example. And Dr. Yu is an ordained Presbyterian pastor in the PCUSA, and then went on to get advanced degrees in church history. And I'd like to start by having you share a little bit of your background, and particularly what drew you to move from pastoral ministry into studying church history, because that's not the typical course for most pastors, I would say.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. Also on the live stream, too, right, yes. Pastor Lisa? Mm-hmm. So, I think for all of us, God creates us. We are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and God gives us different gifts, abilities, and passions. For some of us, like my two children, I have a 16 and 13-year-old, they are quite passionate and gifted at math. And one child is really big on like AP computer science and coding and psychology and the like. Other child get at math. Those are gifts. And for me, history and the liberal arts and English, those were topics in school that were always very enthralling and captivating to me. So on one level, it's kind of strange because my kids really don't like these subjects. But then I remember some of the subjects they like are the subjects I didn't like. So God creates us all differently. So God created me with a desire to really love reading and writing and history. And I always loved American history because it was the history of my country. It was the history of a country that my parents had come to when they were young adults. I was born there shortly after. And it was a country where possibility was a gift and something we treasured. And so, growing up, I loved, for example, reading about the presidents, even some of the lesser presidents. And I just loved learning about different states, like state capitals, and just everything about American history. And so I took that with me, felt a call to ministry, and really enjoyed working in churches and the like. And for me, a Master of Divinity degree is a great degree because it gives you a lot of different skills and tools, but it gives you a little bit of a lot. And so for me, I had a desire, as I was growing, I wanted to learn a lot about this one little thing, about church history, that I didn't get during my Master of Divinity degree. So I said, I'm going to go back to school to get a one-year Master of Theology degree. And what happened there is, I think, long story short, I liked it more than I thought I would, and my professors liked me more than I thought they would. And they encouraged me and said, hey, you're a gifted thinker. Your writing is good, not great, but we can help you with that. Like just to be more concise and precise and all of that, and the like, but do you want to keep doing this? And I was like, what else is there? And they're like, you can get a PhD and you can be a church historian and you can be a theological educator and all of that. And I said, that sounds great. What do I need to do? And then I learned the steps and it all and did that. So for me, it really was. And for a long season, I did think perhaps I could be multivocational or bivocational. This could be a way to do it. What I later learned is that research and writing, it just takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. So that pathway I felt was closed off. I closed it off. So I take those gifts with me. I'm a pastor who really loves history. And now I'm a church historian who really loves pastors and really wants to write and teach in a way that helps pastors do the ministry of working with people of faith in a congregation go well. And so, to end, I'll say, and I think for all of us as people of faith, we're after the honest truth. And I will say, as an historian, it is truth with a lowercase t. It is my best attempt to write truthful lowercase t histories that do not shy away from things that are hard and things that are in some ways kind of depressing and challenging. But for me, it's more the clarity that comes from knowing the truth, and then the liberation that comes from that, so that we can understand who we are, the world, the church that we inhabit, that we have inherited, that we inhabit, so that we can work faithfully to make the reforms that are necessary, giving thanks for the faithfulness of our ancestors, but also recognizing where there was faithlessness and where there was sin, so that we can confront that, not in a way where we feel guilt and shame. You and I are not guilty, and we should not be ashamed for our ancestors' crimes and sins. But what we are is we are responsible for the church and the world that we have inherited and that we inhabit from them, so that we know what they did, so that we can do the things that were good. We can say, here are the good things about the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, that we can continue to do. But here are some of the things that are bad that happened in the churches that we worship in, so that God can help us with a better pathway.
Thank you. And I should have added at the beginning, I'd like to keep this informal. So if you have a follow-up question to anything that we're discussing that you think this is the right time to ask that question, please feel free to raise your hand and go to the microphone. I don't want you to be sitting on your question for 45 minutes and then not paying attention to anything else. So feel free to pop up with questions as necessary. So my second question kind of follows up on that, and I'm glad that you raised the issue of guilt and shame, which is one of the challenges that I think often white individuals have in having discussions about race. And I'm wondering if your background as a Korean American allows you to approach this subject in a way that is a little bit different than white Americans or Black Americans, and kind of what that lens as an Asian American might have brought to your writing. Do I sound like I'm echoing a little bit? Okay, maybe I'm echoing. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Pastor Lisa. I am sometimes asked, why you as an Asian American, Korean American, why do you research the topics that you research? Why did you write the book that you wrote? So one thing I will say is that I am an Asian American who is a church historian of American Christianity. And so the topic that I most want to study and that I focus my research on is the history of American Christianity. And in doing that, what I find is that race is at the heart of much of how Christians understood God, themselves, nation, and the world. So what I would say is that I am not, my initial interest was not necessarily race and racism, but it was a fuller understanding of American Christianity. Why did people believe the way they did? Why did they create the doctrines and practice the faith the way they did? And in doing that, I found not only race and racism, but I found slavery, and in a book that's coming out soon, settler colonialism, I found these at the heart of who we are as Americans, who we were as Americans, who we are. And so that's what drew me to the topics. In this book, What Kind of Christianity, really with my publisher, when I came with a proposal and signed the book contract, it really was to write like this length book on kind of a history of racism in American Presbyterianism, from origins to the present day, through the civil rights movement, for example. And so that was what I spent the first year researching. So I was doing a little bit of all of it, trying to get the whole narrative. But what I found is I found myself so dissatisfied with the treatments on slavery, because oftentimes they were given one chapter in the larger book. And I found so, given one chapter, whether it be consciously or sub or unconsciously, I found that the historians tended to really highlight the biblical disputes. Like the real problem with slavery was these Presbyterians, they disagreed on how to interpret the Bible. It really was a Bible fight, rather than it was a fight about owning people as enslaved. It was a fight about racism and racial discrimination. It was a lot of society, social, and economic, cultural factors. I found all of those things missing, whereas there were lots of stuff on how different Presbyterian theologians and pastors, for example, translated doulos, this word servant or slave in the New Testament. And certainly, that's what they focused on, they wrote about it, but they wrote about it in the larger context of the Compromise of 1820. On what should be a slave state and a free state. They wrote this particularly after 1850, and thinking about that compromise of 1850 and the reinforced and stronger Fugitive Slave Act and the like. That was all there. Fear of the Union dissolving into two, which happened. And that was all part of, like, all of those things were happening. And it's not like they read the Bible and forgot about all those things. It was all those things were happening, and they took all of that into how they read the Bible and interpreted what was happening. And so I said to myself, I think this whole book has to be about slavery and how slavery intensified, both shaped and intensified anti-Black racism. And so that was the book. And I said, I'm just going to write it. And I hope it's really good. And the publisher says, hey, this isn't what you signed and what we agreed on, but they're going to publish it anyway. And that is what happened. And so as an Asian American, I hope that my perspective helps me to be attentive to stories and perspectives that are in the margins. As someone who is often, when I read American history, my own story was often in the margins. It was not a story that was in the mainstreams of the books I was reading, the lectures I was hearing, and what I was studying. So my initial interest in writing about Asian American church history, which I did through my PhD at Emory, it was to write the stories that I wasn't seeing in the books. And even there, I'll say briefly, even not my main advisor, but some of my other faculty colleagues, not colleagues at that point, colleagues of my main advisor who were thinking of serving on my dissertation committee, they did wonder. And they said they looked, it was not an immoral argument, although I was like, you just, you don't want me to write about Asian American history. But more, they were like, it's the academic marketplace. We got to think about this dissertation has to get published into a book. We need to help you get a tenure track position at a university, college, or a seminary. And so even one or two said, do you want to write about something else? Again, they were really thinking about like what publishers wanted to publish at that time. In 2009, 10, I went up until 14. And lo and behold, they were wrong in that even the academic publishing marketplace changed and became more expansive. But for me, what I said is, look, I might only get one shot at this. There might not be a second or third project. This might be the only project I ever do. So I'm going to write about the things that matter to me and my family. I rarely saw people who looked like me in the books that I read. So I'm going to write a book. Who knows if it'll ever publish, who will read it, but I'm going to do it. And it did all of that. But so perhaps that perspective helped me see things that other historians haven't seen. I'm less sure about what it means to be neither black nor white, but to be Asian American or Korean American. I don't know. I can't say for sure what that means. I don't want it to make it seem like this gave me an outsider perspective and like wisdom that no one else had. I'm really like, nor I think the temptation for some Asian Americans themselves to embody when they're in church work or activist work, to think that as someone who is neither this nor that, neither black nor white, that they can kind of, even this spiritual imagery is used, stand in the gap. I can be the bridge builder. There are 400 years of racial enmity between black and white people in the country that either I was born in or my parents, when I came at an early age, I can be the one to bring it all together. I am very, I don't think that's true. I don't think that is the role for Asian American Christians to play. I think it is, while we continue to forge our own stories, to acknowledge that the larger American story is deeply embedded in settler colonialism and slavery. And so, for me, I say as an American church historian, I want to write about, as an American citizen, as an American person, I want to write about the United States, the country in its fullness. And that involves studying histories before my parents got here, because we have inhabited this country. And so that led me to write the book. So I'm a little bit, I feel like Captain Admiral Akbar in Star Wars, it's a trap, It's a trap, I think, when folks suggest like Asian Americans have some kind of special insight, that they have this perspective that they can be the ones to be racial reconcilers and the like. I don't think that's true. I don't mean it in like a hopeless way, but I don't think that's true, and that we all have our own stories to tell. We all have our own perspectives. We all have our own challenges, biases, prejudices that culturally come, that we're all asking God to reform in all of us.
Thank you. That was beautifully said. One of the things, go ahead, please. Come up to the microphone if you wouldn't mind.
Actually, this actually works out that I didn't get a chance to ask this in the previous session. My question is this, that it seems that throughout history, the fear of the other, no matter what, like if it was the Irish or that, there were races, like hatred for those people until they got a big enough mass in which they didn't get impacted and they became part of the U.S. whole. The real question I had is basically this. Have you done any research on the church's racism or the embracing or dealing with the Asian Orientals during the 1800s and 1900s and especially during World War II with the internment camps. And how has that affected the church and the Asian Christian community and different things like that?
Oh yeah, I'll try to be brief. Gosh, it's, yeah. I will say, once upon a time, I was going to say it's not my strong suit. Maybe it never has been, but it was easier earlier in my career when I didn't know that much. I could give a great 3-minute answer, like when I first started, because I don't think I had more than 3 minutes worth to say. But now I feel like I got smarter and I got better as a church historian. So that's the good news. The bad news is hard to get it down to 3 minutes, because, yeah, so, I used to think, I used to be so good at this. I used to give such good short answers. But then I realized it's because I didn't do a lot of research. I didn't really know a better answer than that. I had a sufficient answer, but not a really deep answer. And people were still like, oh, he's brilliant for that 3-minute answer. That's because I don't got nothing else. But what I will say is, to the first point, I do think there has always been a fear of other, xenophobia, and ethnocentrism. I think that continues to be our depraved human condition. I think the challenge there for me is to note, in this context with slavery, how slavery exacerbated and was utilized and employed to deify, justify, sanctify, and explode anti-Black racism. I think anti-Black racism would have been a problem in the United States apart from slavery. I think because of slavery, it was a far greater compounding horrible sin. And I think because of slavery and its economic, cultural, societal, foundational centrality to this country, that led to further defenses of racism as potentially, and in fact what they said would be with religious justifications for racism, rather than saying we are depraved, sinful people, and there's something in us that does think the other is lesser than or stranger than or scarier than us. And that's something that all human people are wrestling with, and God wants us to meet us in that sin and confront it, to repent of it, reform of it, and change it, so that this natural inclination to care and love and desire people who are like us rather than not like us, that's not of God. That's not the gospel, and that's not how God is calling us to live. And we're working towards that. And instead of that happening in some contexts, it was the opposite, sadly, happened. It is to say, actually, God did create different races differently. The racial enmity and the hatred that you have for someone who is not like you, different skin color from you, different national origin you, that's actually there's a lot of biblical evidence to support that. And to support caring and praying for them spiritually, but wanting to be socially separate. That's why slavery is of God. It is for people of lesser races that could not thrive and live in a society with stronger races. And so all of that happened because of slavery. And it was terrible. And it is an explanation and not an excuse for a lot of the white Christian failures of it. And so I will say with that too, certainly I think it is to note the pain and the terror of anti-Asian racism, and to note that there are these different streams of racism that happened and are happening in this country and all over the world. And it is to note that one thing to do is I don't want to get into a shouting match and a competition, that this kind of racism is worse than or should not be ignored versus that kind of racism. I do think there are ways to parse out with history where these different challenges and problems and phenomena of racism came from. What are the economic different ways of enslaved labor and capital versus competition with immigration with Chinese American and other Asian American immigrants, for example, on the West Coast. And then you had World War II with Allies, Axis, Japan, and all of that. But it is to say, this all happened and there are different reasons for it, and it is certainly the common challenge of racism. But I don't want to conflate them all into one. For example, different communities of color have different stories to tell, not only of tragedy, but of triumph. Not only of victimhood, but of resilience. Not only of oppression, but of overcoming that oppression. So that's how I would answer the question. And the other thing I would say is the challenge, let's say, for Asian Americans in thinking about this is, so I think for me and my family, I'm a second-generation Korean American. I married a second-generation Korean American woman, Sarah. Our kids are third-generation Korean American. I don't know yet who they will marry, if they will marry, and all of that. But I do know that we are called to be advocates for our Asian American community. I want them to be proud of who they are. I want them to be proud of their grandparents, their bilingual, bicultural grandparents. And I want them to know the stories of the Korean War and of the resilience and the hardship that their grandparents, my parents, my wife's parents experienced. So I want them to have the richness of that history. I want them to assert that this is a history, these are stories that they should be learning in their schools, that these are not marginal stories, that these are stories too that belong in the mainstreams of education and of civic and religious life. At the same time, I note that they have a responsibility to be allies and partners in supporting other communities of color, and including white communities who are suffering, for example, from poverty and other challenges. They are called to be supportive and to help. And so that is what we're after. And it is to note that sometimes when they are in multiracial settings and groups, there is, I don't want to deny that there is not a competitive ethos that sometimes emerges, because of notions of scarcity, that people in power, they're only going to support one community of color, one non-white racial group. So we got to make sure we're that non-white racial group that gets supported. So it becomes competition, not coalition. I don't want to deny that that exists and that ethos is there. And sometimes too, for me and for my children, we're in contexts where we are seeking to support Black communities, and we're seeking to be good allies. And sometimes it works well, and other times what I will say is sometimes the demand from some, not all, not even many, but a few, Black groups and Black leaders, it very much is your role, as they not speak directly to us, but what we feel is your role is to be our ally. That is why you are Asian American. And I would say, no, that's not true. Why we're Asian American is because God has created us in God's image to be this way, and we have our own destinies to forge, stories to tell, and in the midst of that, we are going to ally and support your movements for justice. But I do not want our identities and our stories to be subsumed by this. And so that is a challenge. So there are occasionally, and again, I don't want to overstate it, but there are occasional moments where we come home from these things as a family and we talk about it. And we say, this is a good cause, but this is not a group, this is not what we're going to fully support. Because in this context, really, we feel our own identities and our own stories being erased. But we understand why that is happening. It is a great challenge. Much of the movements for civil rights in this country came from Black leaders. That is true. My family has benefited greatly from Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Martin Luther King Jr., from the Fair Housing Act that Black leaders really pushed forward. So certainly there are moments where Black leaders today feel discouraged and feel betrayed when other communities of color benefit more from acts and movements that have happened through their group. And so for the Fair Housing Act to be passed, so there is no more segregation in neighborhoods, it is still through extra legal and cultural reasons that other racial groups of color and not Black Americans find more pathways into those communities. And that is really angering, and that is aggravating. Our people pushed hard to get that 1968 FHA Fair Housing Act passed, and it is hard for us to see other communities of color and other families of color living in more integrated neighborhoods than our community. I totally understand that. And so I want to partner with that. And I think that is wrong. And I think that's something that I need to do something about. But occasionally, I am in contexts where I feel like my own racial identity and story, and particularly for my kids, is under threat of being erased because of this anger and because of this fury. And so in those contexts, I don't say the whole movement is wrong. What I say is, this is not a safe, healthy place for my family. There are other groups that are led by Black people and other people of color that we can support. I'm not going to give up on the whole thing because of one bad experience where one Black leader really practiced some anti-Asian racism, or that is how we experienced and felt it. That doesn't mean the whole thing isn't worth doing. But it is to acknowledge why that happened, to tell my kids why that happened, that it was wrong and it was harmful and hurtful for us, but there are actually really good, clear reasons why this transpired the way that it did. And so that's what makes the movement complex, and that's what makes it hard. But I think that's what makes it worth doing. And for us as Asian Americans and my kids to really figure out, like, where we can be, how we can do this work well. I think the big thing is I want to tell my kids, you are not a supporting actor in someone else's story. You're a main actor, not with that like main character energy thing where they're like, all that, but like we're not in the margins of Black America and white America. We really are Americans, and we are Christians, and we are faithful, and we're going to do our best to do what we can, while recognizing that we stand on the shoulders of a lot of both Black and white advocates and leaders that did a lot of good in this country that made it possible for us to be here today. The last thing I'll say is, so when my kid was 4, Maddie, my older kid, she learned about Rosa Parks and segregation, and she learned it because the teacher did a good job. It was just very visual with like real like figures and a real bus, and she saw how it was wrong. She was like, white people sit on the front, Black people sit in the back, and when more white people came, the Black people don't even get to sit in the back, they just stand. So of course my kid came home from school and said, that was really wrong, that was really messed up. Of course it was. But then Maddie asked, Daddy, where would have we sat on that bus? Right? She doesn't remember, I've talked about it with her, but she asked, and I said, my honest answer is, I don't know. What I would say is, it is likely, because if this was before 1965, immigration laws would have made it very difficult for a family like us to be here. But if we were here, if we had come before, I think it would have depended. I think some bus drivers would have let us sit in the front of the bus, and other bus drivers would have not let us sit on the front of the bus and told us to sit in the back of the bus with the Black passengers. And I think what I would hope for us is that we would join in the struggle to say it is wrong for any person of color to not sit where they wanted on that bus. I think that's the most honest answer I can give. An honest answer is, I think it depends partly on class too. If we were wealthy in that community in the Deep South, maybe some bus drivers would have said, okay, you're okay, you can sit with the white people. It's kind of what happened in South Africa when Japanese businessmen started going there in apartheid South Africa. It was hard for the government. They didn't know what to call them and what to do with them and how to designate them and their status. And ultimately what they said, and this shows the ongoing reverberations of racism and all of that, they said their designated status, I think, was something like honorary white people, like something around. And it is, even to tell these businessmen, white is better than Black in South Africa. And so for us, I would say sometimes that might happen and we might receive those messages. And we have to challenge those messages. We have to say white is not better than Black. We are all equal in God's sight, and we should all be equal under the law and even extra-legal culture. And so we've got to find a way to do that.
Beautiful. Thank you. You're talking about your daughter's experience in school. One of the things that you mention in your book is how much we are influenced in our understanding of race and slavery by what we are taught in school. And I remember, and you point this out in your book, and I remember it's one of the things that I learned in school, was that, maybe the people of that era didn't really understand how bad slavery was. Maybe, they kind of knew that it was bad, but they didn't really know the extreme of it, especially maybe in the North or those who are not living, around enslaved persons. But you point out in wonderfully detail about just how much was known amongst the common people about what was happening in slavery. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about how, what would an average congregation have known about what was happening with enslaved people in the North and the South? Was it really ignorance, or was it really trying to excuse it and not really ignorance?
Oh yeah, it's a hard question, because at one level, I do think what we have to recognize in our present is that we will never know the degradations and the pains and the injustices of slavery as much as the people living then did. So when we think they didn't know how bad slavery was, I do think that's a challenging and, quite frankly, untrue statement. Because of course they knew it better than we will ever know. How can we know something apart from a time machine that they knew and that they lived in? So really, they knew it was bad, they knew all of its evil, but what happened in their day was there were great efforts to dilute. There were great efforts to say that the bad things that were happening were the exception and not the rule. Oh, that most enslavers were church-going people, were Christians. So surely some of the ones who weren't going to church, they abused, they physically abused, they sexually violated enslaved people. But most of it was just a kind of patriarchal system. Yes, they worked hard. Yes, it's not fair, but it's part of our society. So there are great efforts in writing and speaking to really present slavery in that way, and in ways that were built up through the media, through newspapers of their day, such that it was possible for a white person in 1860 to really think that slavery was not that bad. But the point I want to make is that how that happened was through great, great effort. That didn't happen like by accident or by chance. That happened because there were white people and white leaders, including some white theologians and pastors, that made that happen, that worked hard and that participated in all of the smart, intricate ways to make that happen, to let that viewpoint be the dominant viewpoint, for example, in the South. It was both a self-deception, but it was also a cultural deception that came through the work of human beings, and so Americans. So what I want to point out, and I'll end this answer shortly, is that I want to move us away from understanding racism in the past as a shadowy evil with no perpetrators. Racism was just really bad. All of the people, it was just so bad for all of the people, and they couldn't do anything about it. But the thing is, racism was an evil that was not shadowy, but actually was quite apparent. And racism happened and continued to happen because, for example, in the Presbyterian Church, capital C, there were moments at general assemblies and in church meetings where people of faith got together and discerned and made intentional decisions to continue to support the enslavement of Black Americans, to make intentional decisions to say, really, the answer to anti-Black racism in the northern states among the free Black population is the colonization movement to Liberia, rather than working to reform our cities and our society to be more racially just. That these, again, were with intention and with deliberation, rather than these kind of succumbing to a shadowy evil that just absorbed people's souls and made them terrible and racist. Really, it was all happening through discernment and determination.
One of the most fascinating parts of reading this book for me was exactly what you highlight there, was how the Presbyterian Church used our polity, our governing rules of the church, to avoid addressing the issues of slavery. You do a great polity job of showing how different sessions and general assemblies worked around actually having votes on things. And so the title, What Kind of Christianity, made me think about our own complicity in the Presbyterian Church, especially about using polity as a weapon, or a polity as a way of avoiding difficult discussions. In the Presbyterian tradition, we pride ourselves on being decently and in order, right? You hear that over and over and over again. So much so that it was a drinking game when I was in seminary. How many times did somebody say decently and in order today in polity class? But we use that decently and in order as a way of avoiding sometimes those hard conversations that we have. And so this book really challenged my thinking about that. And it reminded me of Martin Luther King's letter to a Birmingham jail about the kind of lukewarm, Christians, the white pastors in the South who, kind of refused to take a stand. And I'm wondering whether you still see that happening in the church today, of us not wanting to make kind of hard decisions or have hard conversations, and using the structure of the church as a rationale for not doing that.
Yes, I think, okay, so the challenge here, so one is, I will say something, and I'll get to the polity, I promise, Pastor Lisa. So one thing I ran into when I was telling people from roughly maybe 2018 through 2021 in writing what became the book is when I told people this book I'm writing on, they would say, oh, it's because Presbyterians supported slavery because of Reformed theology, right? It's part of the frozen chosen, not being very active in civic engagement and social change, or it was just believing in human depravity and the church and the world that it was just as is. So the answer was Presbyterians were pro-slavery and participated in racial oppression against black people because of Reformed theology, right? Because they were Reformed people. I ran into the answer a lot. So I was surprised. And what I find, and I write in the book, is actually I think there is nothing inherent in Reformed theology that automatically or immediately lends itself to being pro-slavery and anti-abolition. I think certainly you can apply and interpret some theological principles to get there, but I don't think Reformed theology was the problem. And the example I give, quite honestly, is when I compare the success of the abolitionist movement in England and Scotland in particular, the parent church, if you will, the Mother Kirk, for some of us who know that kind of language. There, by 1830, other historians argue, any sensible, literate Scot who was likely Presbyterian thought slavery was wrong. And so it shows why in the United States did it look differently. And so I don't think Reformed theology in and of itself was the problem. In fact, because I don't want to overstate the number, but many early black abolitionists were Presbyterian themselves. I write in the book, the most significant national abolitionist movement, the American Anti-Slavery Society, started in 1833 by William Lloyd Garrison, white abolitionists, few others. I looked at the minutes and I saw their executive committee. They even used that language of executive committee. Sounds like Presbyterians. In 1833, 6 of the 12 founding executive committee members self-identified as Presbyterian. That is half. Now, none of them were pastors in big steeple churches and the like, so I don't want to overstate it. But it is to note, Theodore S. Wright, Samuel Eli Cornish, James W.C. Pennington, 3 leading black Presbyterian ministers, all leading abolitionists. They did not see Reformed theology as the problem. They saw white Presbyterians and how they applied the Reformed theology in the Bible. That was the problem. So similarly, to get to the point about our structures and our polity and parliamentary procedure and our book of order, I wrestled with saying that is the problem. I do wonder if it is how Presbyterians apply and use the structures that we have that are actually meant to be, in some cases, democratic, that are meant to be so that no 1 or 2 people can take over a meeting. The moderator is empowered through the Book of Order and the Roberts Rules of Order to make sure that doesn't happen. So then it becomes, is it the structure or is it the people inhabiting and using that structure and wanting to avoid painful, hard conversations and deliberations and finding ways through the structure to avoid them? The structure simultaneously can free so that we can have these conversations, but can also restrain them. So that's where I don't know that the problem is Reformed theology. I don't know the problem is church polity. But maybe the problem is like people not honestly being honest with themselves and honest with their communities of faith about the conversations that need to be had and the work that needs to be done. And then saying, here's this principle in Reformed theology we can use, separation of politics and religion. Here is something in the Book of Order we can use to kind of move us away from like the hard conversations.
Yeah. So we use those things to avoid rather than them being the rationale. One of the things that struck me as you were writing about the power of slavery to really shape the American faith and the faith traditions, and why didn't just Presbyterians get rid of slavery and say, you have a wonderful quote on in the book, and it was not just for economic reasons, that slave ownership, like home ownership or wearing fashionable clothing, was a visible social marker signifying success. And so while the actual number of people who may have had enslaved persons might have been lower, there were people who aspired to be part of that class, just as people today might aspire to have a certain car or live in a certain neighborhood, because it was a marker of economic success. So I had never really thought about the kind of cultural implications of that. But what it made me think of is when Brian and I were living in Hilton Head Island before we moved here, and I apologize to all of those folks in Hilton Head who I'm going to offend now. We lived on a plantation. Everything on Hilton Head was a plantation. They were all named plantations. We lived on Hilton Head Plantation. And there was a lot of discussion about whether they should change the name of plantation, and it never got anywhere while we were living there. But part of the discussion was the lifestyle of the plantation. That was what people were aspiring to when they retire. They wanted to aspire to a certain lifestyle, which was a plantation was a nomenclature for that kind of economic success and lifestyle. And it made me realize that that probably was ingrained in Southern culture for hundreds of years, if not, because it wasn't just those who had slaves who were supporting the lifestyle, the slavery movement, but those of other economic domains who saw that as a lifestyle to be desired, which was a kind of an interesting point. And I want to highlight one other thing that you talk about that was kind of a surprising statistic to me. And this has to do, I grew up in the state of Maryland, which was, not really north, not really south, kind of north, kind of south. And I had always kind of had an understanding of slavery benefiting the South economically, while there was some North benefit as well, but mostly an economic benefit to the South. And you talk about here about the General Assembly, the PCUSA's national body, about how they chose to invest their money. And going back into the 1800s, the General Assembly included a financial report from the denominations board showing that the trustees moved $81,402.28 from banks in northern states to banks in southern states of Alabama, Kentucky, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Virginia, and you give the amounts, because of higher interest rates, because they could make more money by investing their funds into bank accounts in the southern states. And I think about our own conversations that we have in the Presbyterian denomination today about mission responsibility through investment, and how the Presbyterian Church has a long history of not always voting with our dollars the way that we profess to vote in our theology. And I'm wondering if you can kind of address maybe some of the parallels between that time and today.
Oh, okay. Yes, thanks. So I think that is in the 1836 General
Yeah.
Assembly minutes. So here's what I'll say. So it was me carefully, reading through all of the General Assembly minutes, some of them 500 pages long, but, just kind of looking through and finding. But what I will say is that, one is this wasn't done in secret, and also what I will say is it was not done without criticism. What really led me to look at those figures more was actually I also saw abolitionists criticizing the Presbyterian Church in the USA General Assembly for doing that and for saying that you are willing to compromise morally for a higher interest rate. Literally, that is what one abolitionist who also understood what was happening in the PCUSA said. So it's not as if this was not known. And in fact, what pointed me to look at it more carefully was not only looking at the General Assembly minutes, but looking at abolitionist literature and how abolitionists themselves, living in the same time period, criticized churches, noting it's natural. Of course, we want higher interest rates because higher interest rates lead to better returns. Of course, that's good. That's something everyone wants. But even these abolitionists said, do you have a soul? Do you have any morality? Do you know why those southern banks are offering higher interest rates? It is because of slavery and enslavement and wanting to accrue more money so that they can grow the slave economy. And that is why they're doing it. And so you have to draw a line somewhere. It is not wrong to look for higher interest rates. We live in a capitalist society. It is wrong to look for higher interest rates when measuring it to simple human decency and morality. And I think that would be true today. I don't think I am against wise financial investing and good financial work. And this is something we all have to wrestle with, while wrestling with a global capitalist order that is inequitable, that is not fully just. Some would say not even just at all. But this is the society and the world we live in. So we're wrestling with. So for me too, it is similar. How do we invest wisely in things that will bring a return, but things that also measure with morality? That the highest interest rate, the highest return is not the main goal, at any means or at any cost. But it is responsible financial investment that weighs and considers theological and moral principles. And sometimes 3% can be better than 5% when you consider everything else in play. So I think that's what was happening then. So that's why I don't want to be naive about what was happening in the 1830s, that they didn't know these things, that they didn't know about higher interest rates, and they didn't know about capital gains and all of the like. They really did understand it. And the other thing I will say that is in current work, and I shared this at People's Church, is what I find in the abolitionist movement, I don't see a lot of capitalist criticism. And maybe I need to study it more and I'll see it there. For example, the black abolitionists that I've studied, such as Frederick Douglass, James Forten, this wealthy sailmaker in Philadelphia, Maria Stewart, activist and teacher in Boston, New York, and eventually Washington, D.C. She was a nurse at the Freedmen's Hospital, which is now the Howard University Hospital. But I don't think they were critical of early modern antebellum American capitalism as a whole and as a system. What they criticized was that it was racially discriminatory, and that even free black people after slavery did not have the same opportunities to own property, to get into the middle class, and to make an honorable, decent wage, to have dignity and flourishing for them and future generations and generational wealth. The problem was not the American dream. The problem was access to the American dream. Now, later activists and thinkers and scholars living today, for example, and even into the 1930s, they did see in this movement some seeds for anti-capitalist critique and critique of the whole capitalist order and critique and a need for more large-scale federal government intervention. So that is true too. And so for us today, I think it is, one argument for us is, so what is hard for me as I wrestle with it too is when I see and I read in Christian literature and activist literature like, oh, capitalism, it's so terrible. I wrestle with that. I think some things are, but I also acknowledge, like, this is the system we live in. Is it possible to be a faithful Christian in a global capitalist order that we live in? I think it is. I don't think it's easy, but I think it's possible. And so it's for me to wrestle with how we can enact that. In the same way, I feel like in the 1830s, abolitionists were wrestling with how can we create a more just capitalist system so that black people have not equality of outcome, but equality of opportunity, so that we have an opportunity. And they would argue, actually, that equality of opportunity would lead to equality of outcome. So, given equal opportunity, it's not black perfection. It's not that every black person will rise into the middle class. Some of us will and some of us will not. No different than what is happening in the white population in the antebellum United States. So the problem is we want the same mathematical outcomes as you. We believe the same percentage of our population with equal opportunity will be, in James Fortin's language, useful members of society. And so that's what we're wrestling with today. I think some activists today would agree with something like that. I think other activists would say, no, we need to dismantle the whole system. And so that's something that we can wrestle with. But yeah, that's again a hard conversation. Anyways, and so we don't need to talk about democratic socialism and and all that. But so their argument is that socialism is bad because it's coercive. It is forced, forced outcomes of equality. But democratic socialism argues, and it is very hard to find a good definition online on Google. But to me, what I see it as arguing is that it is more equal opportunities for all, that the people have collectively or enough consensus, the majority of people have decided that we want more distribution of wealth, that we want to tax the wealthy more so that people who have less can have more opportunities and resources to get into the middle class. So it is wrong if the government forces that upon people, if leaders force that on people. It is something that we want to happen through democratic elections, that we want to persuade the majority of the American people that sharing the wealth more, that taxing people in higher income brackets more will lead to more flourishing for more people. We don't want to force that on anyone, but we want to convince you that this is the way that we should go. To me, that is the difference between the democratic socialist movement in the United States than what happened in Latin America, for example, and why so many Latin American immigrants, migrants, and refugees are so opposed to, for example, the modern-day Democratic Party and language of socialism, because it was a coercive, tyrannical, oppressive system in their home countries, and they don't want to see it in now their host country, the United States. And so that's something that we have to wrestle with. For me too, as you can hear in my thinking aloud, I am deliberating with whether I will support democratic socialism. I don't presently, but I am wrestling with, as I do research and as I learn about it, how this may or may not accord with my Christian principles and my understandings. So right now, as of today, I don't have a great answer for whether I support it or not. I'm trying to understand the merits, and I'm trying to wrestle with, what do I think about capitalism? I don't want to just say capitalism is awesome, but neither do I want to say capitalism is terrible. I really do want to, as I grow in my life as a Christian, have a better understanding of what does Christ want me to say about the capitalism that I've inherited, that I inhabit.
Wow, a lot to think about there.
I know. I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer.
I want to move into a slightly different topic about Christianity. But if there's anybody that has any follow-up questions on that topic, I want to leave some space for that right now. Go right ahead. Yep. And then, yep. So walk over to the microphone, please. Thank you. Yep.
I'm wondering about the major issues facing the Presbyterian Church, early 1800s. The new light, old light. So revivalism was a threat to the established hierarchy, let's say. That issue and maybe others, how were they interwoven with Presbyterian response to slavery?
I hope, thank you, sir. There was a division in 1741 over revivalism, and seeing the itinerant revivalists and that movement as being threatening to the order of churches and what we might call parish or congregational ministry. And it lasted roughly 17 years, and there was reunion in 1758. And the plan of that reunion, did have a statement or an understanding that continues to live in Presbyterian church polity today that I found helpful. They said, we're going to reunite. We divided over slavery. People on both sides said horrible things to one another. Gilbert Tennant, a New Light revivalist Presbyterian, said, I do. I regret some of my language. I should not have called all the anti-revivalists Pharisees. That was bad. I shouldn't have done that. He said that in 1740. And he said, it was bad. I think the title of his pamphlet was The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry. Those that don't support revivals. It's not actually a Christian argument. They're actually not Christian. So that's the problem. But so he said, some of the language, kind of coarse. But they said, we're going to do three things moving forward. When there is disagreement, every Presbyterian, and when there is a decision that is made and that is voted on, for example, at that point it was probably a synod. There was no General Assembly yet. You have three options. You can actively concur. I am for that decision. You can passively submit, or you can peaceably withdraw. These are the three options that continue to exist in the PCUSA Book of Order. It is in a little footnote in the freedom of conscience in the G part, the form of government part. Yeah, but anyways, 2.0, anyways, I don't want to get into the number. But so that it continues to reside today. And so similarly, there was a division in the 1830s over some theological principles. Likely it was over this idea, gosh, I don't want to get too much into it. But okay, we're all sinners. Why are we all sinners? One party said we're all sinners because we have inherited Adam's sin. It was this theological notion, they called it the imputation of Adam's sin. And literally, it's kind of a littler interpretation of even Romans 5. As Adam sinned, we all sin. And as Christ has, overcome sin, we all overcome sin. So we're all sinners because of original sin. And some Presbyterians were like, that seems a little fatalistic to us. Like, that's not, like, we're all sinners because, again, this is their language, because sin consists in the sinning. We're sinners not because we've inherited this sin from Adam way back when. We're sinners because we sin. And so that's why. So they all said human depravity. Yes, humans are depraved. But one said they want to accentuate it. In part it was to keep this covenant theology going. As all have fallen and sinned in Adam, all are raised in Christ. They really saw that as something valuable to uphold. And others said, no, that's way too fatalistic and that's way too like God determining things, over-deterministic. So we're going to do that. So while that fight was happening, though, there was another fight over slavery. And so certainly these things were going on, but it is hard to totally link them together. So some want to say the 1837 split was over slavery. But the challenge with that interpretation, and literally they called themselves the PCUSA Old School and New School. That's not my language for them. That was their language. And the New Schoolers were those who were like, sin consists in the sinning. Not in Adam's sin, but in my sin and your sin. So that group, certainly, there were more abolitionists in that group, and that group was more open to the abolitionist movement, but that was not an abolitionist split in that still remained a national denomination with southern and northern churches. And yes, more outspoken abolitionists belong to the New School, but also pro-slavery Presbyterians belong to the New School. So really, those divisions didn't happen until 1857 and 1861. New School first, then Old School. But so I want to say it was all part of what was happening. And so I will also say is that certainly Presbyterians wrestled deeply understanding that at every General Assembly, whether slavery was on the docket or not, it was always in the room. It was always something that they wrestled with because it was always something that the United States wrestled with. So even when you don't see it in the minutes, you know that it's there. So even in 1836, they said, this is wild. When they were debating over slavery, the decision that they ultimately made is for an indefinite postponement to talk about slavery. Not even like, we'll get to it next year, or we'll get to it the year after, we'll do more some research. They said, we're going to indefinitely postpone it. because they saw how bad it was. And certainly at the same time, the U.S. House of Representatives also did that as well, from I think 1836 to 47. And it was called the gag rule, I think because John Quincy Adams, in a different time, after he lost the presidency to Andrew Jackson, he became a congressman representing his district in Massachusetts. And he complained, and he said, for the U.S. House of Representatives to take up no resolutions on slavery, it is as if you were putting a gag in my mouth, that I cannot speak on this thing. So certainly what was happening in the Presbyterian Church was also happening in politics. And yeah, so anyways, that's the answer.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And I really thank you as a Presbyterian denomination for doing what you're doing, and welcoming me. I'm a retired pastor in the ELCA Lutheran Church, and as I'm asking the question now because Pastor Lisa, you talked about not waiting 45 minutes, and so that's why I'm asking, because I'm just wondering, I'm thinking in my mind, I don't know of anyone in our denomination that has done the analysis and study that you have. I know there is a retired pastor who wrote a book, I have it in my audiobooks, United States, the Resurrection of American Terror. I don't know, Ken Wheeler, his name, Reverend Ken Wheeler, he's a retired ELCA pastor also. But he's not a scholar like you. I mean, nothing against him, but, you know, he went the pastoral route and wrote a book. But I'm wondering if what you're saying would be similar in the ELCA, which I would maybe guess it would be, what you're saying, how slavery has been actualized in the ELCA too. And then that makes me think, is it like this in other denominations too? And if we don't have anyone like you, would you teach someone in the ELCA to do what you're doing?
I think there are great scholars in the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America.
Yeah.
And I think it has been similar to, it has been a group of people of faith who are really trying to be inclusive of many different cultural, theological, and political perspectives. So the ELCA, like the PCUSA, and I don't want to get into triumphalism here, better than others, but I think these two denominations are an example of churches, capital C, that really do want to be inclusive of a wider range of viewpoints than some of the more conservative churches like the Missouri Lutheran Synod, yes, and the like. That really, for example, say, if we don't ordain women to deacon, elder, or pastor. That would be the language in the PCUSA. PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, does that too. So I do think PCUSA, ELCA are trying to have a wider group of people. And sometimes that is challenging, to have more conservative, not maybe staunchly conservative, to be anti-woman in ministry, but to have more conservative viewpoints and more progressive viewpoints, all worshiping together and discerning together. In some ways, some of the more conservative, staunchly conservative denominations, or even the few staunchly progressive denominations, it is, in one way, not as challenging to discern together when there is so much consensus on certain issues. But when you have a bigger group, it is challenging. But I do think there are ELCA ministers and thinkers and the like that are really studying your church's capital C history well.
Yeah, and I think Pastor Wheeler is one too. And, what was I going to say? Oh, I know, because I have great respect for what Willie Bryant is doing in Lansing with the Justice League. And in 2019, we call it Churchwide Assembly. I forget the language you use, but the General Assembly, we call it Churchwide Assembly. In 2019, the Assembly adopted an apology for the for a declaration to apologize to African Americans. And it's a whole, it's a statement, 1 or 2 pages, and now they've made a study on it. But I've tried to lift it up in the last number of years, but, a lot of congregations probably don't even know about it and don't, that's a whole nother story. But they did do that. And, a lot of passionate people, and the whole assembly voted on, yes, this is a document of the ELCA. So we did do that, but I'm looking forward to reading your book.
I would encourage, Dr. Yu does talk about other denominations in here, the Episcopal Church and the Methodist Church, and parallel structures and arguments. So while it may be heavily exampled with Presbyterian examples, I think there are some general principles that are applicable across other, what we would call the mainline Protestant denominations. We can even talk where that language of the mainline came from, right? I want to ask one theological, religious question, and then we'll open it up for a little bit more discussion. Worship and baptism and the role that they played in slavery and in conferring individuals, those who were enslaved, with certain rights but not other rights. And one of the things that is really tough to read in this book is how the principle of baptism was used in some ways to lift up those who were enslaved as siblings in Christ, but at the same time to say they're not quite siblings in Christ. And same with the ability to come together and worship or take communion. And I'm wondering if you could just share a little bit about how baptism, communion, our sacraments, and worship played out within the movement of slavery.
Oh, certainly. So let's take those 2 sacraments. They were deeply challenging to pro-slavery Christianity because baptism signified equality. So what pro-slavery Christians did, even preceding the quote-unquote mainline Protestants, the Church of England, before the United States was a nation, they did really come to a conclusion in the 1660s to understand that baptism to enslaved persons confers religious, not civil liberty. That one is free in Christ, free to be a Christian, share the same destiny and eternal destination, heaven, but it has no bearing on one's civil status. And the reason they did that was because some enslaved people were claiming after baptism that they are empowered by God and by the church to be free not just spiritually, but to be free materially and actually in life. And so that was a challenge, and that was something that Christians really had to wrestle with. How do we conceive of and understand baptism? And so in one way, that does create a kind of like a separation, a kind of two-handedness about it. Yes, in the church we will proclaim all are loved and all are equal and all are beloved in God's sight. And baptism and the new birth and the new life in Christ is an example of that. But we're going to say that that doesn't apply to what happens outside of the church. And that in some ways, your spiritual identity is more important than your civil one. So don't worry too much about your civil identity, because your real identity has been taken care of. You are secure in Christ. And the other challenge they wrestled with that was certainly with the sacrament of communion. And one thing they wrestled with, and it felt wrong to them, and somehow they figured out how to make it feel right, was inviting black worshipers to partake of the bread and the wine after all the white worshipers had eaten and drank. And to say that that is actually like a good way to do it. And so even Frederick Douglass, so this is again to say that they were not ignorant and they didn't understand it, they didn't have no nuance or anything back then. In some of his abolitionist speeches after he escaped slavery, he would mimic a white pastor doing the communion liturgy and saying, after all the white worshipers have eaten, because God is no respecter of persons. You too, black people, come to the table. And people in the audience, and he would pause and stop because he knew people in his audiences would laugh. They would laugh at the white pastor that he was caricaturing and making fun of, to say this is how ridiculous slavery is. That he would mimic with a white southern drawl a white pastor saying that. So they knew that it was wrong, and they knew that that wasn't illustrative of God's creative order and God's love and justice. But white Southern Christians and Presbyterians and otherwise, they really believed that that was the right thing. And in fact, some said it was such a beautiful illustration of spirituality and God's love, because they knew that enslaved people and white people in enslaved homes, that they would never eat at the same table. You know, that's what happened. And it is to say that that's what happened, and it is for us to note cultural captivity is an explanation and not an excuse. It helps to explain the warping and the manipulating of the Christian faith, but it does not excuse it. It does not make it seem that that's okay. It's not an out clause. Oh, it's because of the culture. They were so bad because of the culture. Yes, they were so bad because of the culture, but not all of them were so bad. And they had pathways to do different things and make different decisions. And they did not choose those pathways. And so what we can learn without guilt and shame, but with responsibility and a commitment to repair, is that we need to choose different pathways, that we need to faithfully interrogate how culture intersects with our faith in ways that are both good and bad. And the bad ways, we need to say, no, we're not going to do that anymore. And so that would be my hope from learning about baptism and communion, that these are really clear indications that we have to do things differently. But they too can even be manipulated in ways that Christians did to, again, explain away their complicity in real bad stuff.
I want to open it up to any other questions that folks might have. I will put a plug in that I'm going to be doing an online book study of this book beginning in the second week of January. I would encourage you, if you have an interest, to get the book between now and then so that you can do some reading. I will be sharing some more information about how you can sign up for that. If you're not a member at PCO, please reach out to me. Easy email, pastorlisa@okemespres.org, or contact our church if you're interested in participating in the book study. Other questions that folks might have? Yes? No, we don't have any books to sign, I'm sorry. I have one last question if nobody else has any questions. What surprised you or shocked you the most as you were working on this book? And
I can share, Pastor Lisa, with this book and a book that, so after finishing that book, I really got to work on same publisher, same Broken Promise. So they did say, you know, it's good. This is good that you wrote this really great denominational history. Can you write a broader history for people who are both Presbyterian and not Presbyterian, such as Lutherans and otherwise? Like kind of a broad, nice look at history of racial justice and justice, and I say, sure, be glad to do it. And there too, I said, I'm actually not going to write the whole thing, but I'm going to focus on settler colonialism and slavery. And I'm really going to look carefully at how these two phenomena shaped and misshaped Christianity in the United States. And so what I will say, one surprise is, when I look at the indigenous rights movement, for example, to protect Cherokee land after Andrew Jackson became president, and the Indian Removal Act, ultimately passed in 1830, was coming to be. And when I look at the abolitionist movement, one thing that inspires me is that, again, perhaps not the critical mass that I want and you want, but there was a critical mass of Christians in multiracial coalitions, indigenous, white, and black Christians, that really did work to oppose. They worked hard to oppose the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act. And they spoke loudly and mobilized people to say, this is wrong, to force northern white citizens to assist in the recapture of escaped enslaved persons moving south to north. We will not participate in the recapture. It was wrong to force the removal of the Cherokee Nation from Georgia and some parts of North and South Carolina. It was really known. In 1828, 1829, I was inspired by they called it the anti-removal campaign. That some white Christian leaders, Jeremiah Evarts was this young lawyer who really from Connecticut, who really got involved in this. And they really did persuade a lot of people. Lots of American citizens, white citizens, sent anti-removal petitions to the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate. Jeremiah Evarts persuaded one of the Beecher siblings, Catherine Beecher, sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe and Henry Ward Beecher. They met together in Boston, where he lived. She was vacationing there. And Jeremiah Evarts said, hey, Catherine, you should get really involved in this movement that I'm participating in with Cherokee leaders to protect their land from this really unjust thing that Andrew Jackson and his party is trying to do. And she said, okay. And she wrote a petition, and it was, and historians note this, it was the first public political movement from U.S. women in U.S. history. It was the first time white women mobilized and got involved on a grand scale. And it was to protest the Indian Removal Act. I think the act passed by 5 votes in the House of Representatives. And even some congressmen in Andrew Jackson's, the Democratic Party then, just didn't show up. They were too scared to vote no, but they did not want to vote yes. But sadly, we know how the story ends. We know that the Trail of Tears happened, and it is a devastating story. It reminds me, and this is in the book that's coming out, Chief Junaluska, I pronounced him right, Cherokee leader. Some white missionaries working together with some Cherokee Christians, another good example of partnership. They worked hard, and they translated the Gospel of Matthew into Cherokee. And they brought it to him, the chief, and he got it. And I don't know how much of it he read through, but he looked at it, and he said, and I hope I get the quote right, "This seems like a good book. Strange to me that the white people are not better, having had it so long." It's funny, but it's true, and it's but the point of all this is to say, like, there are a lot of, again, yes, these movements failed, and I too grieve the consequences and the need for us to get involved in racial reconciliation, restoration, repair, and reparation. I think we need all of those things. But it is to note that there were people who fought the good fight. There were people then who understood what the stakes were, and we need to do what is right. And so that we too can do that as well, that we too can be inspired to do what is right, that we too can say these things that are happening in our society, in our church, in our world, we can say these things are wrong, and we can figure out to build diverse coalitions that will get to consensus. Again, maybe not unanimity, some compromise will be required. To say in a certain community, we're going to fight xenophobia and anti-immigration rhetoric and policy. In other communities, we're going to fight police brutality and violence against black and brown people. We're going to do these works, things that make sense in our context, in our community, and ultimately things that will be good for our nation. So that is my surprise. In the midst of writing horrible, tragic stories of failure, there are so many moments of inspiration. And so, so I'll end it there, Pastor Lisa.
Thank you. And I think that is a beautiful way to end it, that moving ourselves from guilt and shame to responsibility to response, to find those ways that we can work to make a more beloved community. I thank you all for coming out on this Sunday afternoon. And I hope you, if you've not read this book, will be inspired to pick it up. I would encourage you to start with chapter 7, which is a summary of the book. It's also very hard to read, but it will give you a broad overview, and then if you then dig into some of the statistics. So there's a lot of wonderful data in the book. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Pastor Lisa.